Story 1. The space under the stairs. I still hate hearing a deadbolt slide into place. Not because it reminds me of safety, but because it reminds me of that Tuesday in July when I was 10 and home alone in my parents' split level on Briar Glen Drive. The evening news was on too loud. Rain was ticking at the windows, and I went to grab a toy from the little closet under the stairs. I reached for the knob, and there was a heavy metal slide lock across the inside of the door that I know for a fact had not been there an hour earlier. My name's Dana Keene. I'm 31 now, and when I was a kid I spent a lot of afternoons alone because both my parents worked double shifts. That day was a rainy Tuesday in the middle of July, the kind of hot, sticky day where the air felt used up, except our house on Briar Glen always ran cold in the wrong places. It was a drafty split level from the 1950s with thin walls, squeaky floorboards, and old carpet that smelled like dust, mothballs, and the damp basement air that drifted up through the vents. I was at the kitchen table doing long division with a sweating glass of water beside me, waiting for the 6 o'clock news and then for my parents to get home after dark. It wasn't unusual. I had a routine. Homework first, then television, then check the front window every 10 minutes. Like that somehow made them arrive faster. Under the stairs we had this little crawlspace closet where old board games, winter boots, and my plastic horse stable got shoved when company came over. I remember getting up to grab one of the horses because I'd finished my worksheet and the rain had gotten louder, and for some reason that made the whole house feel smaller. When I got to the closet door, I saw a wet little handprint on the outside of it, low down, about where my own hand would have landed. The fingers were narrow and glossy with water, and I watched it fade into the painted wood like it was being blotted from the other side. I told myself I'd sloshed my water earlier, which I had, and probably brushed the door with my sleeve without noticing. That made sense. It had to make sense. I remember actually nodding to myself like if I acted normal enough my body would catch up. I wiped the spot with the hem of my shirt and went back to the table. I tried to finish the next problem, but I kept listening to the house settle. It always made those sharp little pops in the walls, regular enough that when I was younger I used to pretend somebody was walking around upstairs. I told myself that was all this was, two old house noises, rain, me getting jumpy because my parents were late. I even took another drink of water and stared hard at the worksheet like I could press myself back into the afternoon I'd been having 5 minutes earlier. But I didn't go near the closet again right away. I noticed I was keeping it in the side of my vision. Then the door started tapping. Not banging, not shaking from a push. Tapping. A neat, patient little knock from inside the wood. Quick enough that after a few seconds I realized I was matching it with my own heartbeat. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. I stood up so fast my chair legs scraped the linoleum, and the sound of that in the empty kitchen almost made me cry. The air around the closet had that cold it always had, except stronger, like standing in front of an open freezer. I crouched down a little, just enough to look at the gap under the door, and a thread of cold air touched my shin. It smelled like wet wool and something sweet underneath it. Not candy sweet, more like fruit left in a lunchbox too long. I said, "Hello?" Because I was 10, and that's what you do when you still think the world has rules. The tapping stopped. Then I heard a whisper through the door, so soft I thought at first it was the television in the other room. It said, "Birdie." That was my grandmother's name for me. She died the winter before. I remember trying very hard not to make this into something. That's the only way I can explain it now. My brain was working so hard to build normal explanations that I could feel it. Maybe the news anchor had said something that sounded like it. Maybe one of the neighbor kids was outside the window and I heard it weird through the rain. Maybe I was thinking about my grandmother because her old sewing box was in that closet and my own thoughts had gotten tangled with the sound of the house. I told myself all of that in about 10 seconds. I also stepped backward the entire time I was doing it. Then, from the front hall, I heard every lock on our front door click at once. The chain gave a dry little jerk. The knob lock turned. The deadbolt snapped over. I was the only one home and I did not have a key. After that, something in me gave up on acting calm. I ran to the front door and grabbed the knob with both hands. It wouldn't move. I yanked so hard my palms slipped and burned. I shouted for my mom even though I knew she wasn't there. Then I ran back toward the kitchen because the phone was on the wall by the fridge, and as I passed the living room I could hear the television droning on about traffic and weather like none of this mattered. The closet door was vibrating now, a fine hard tremor, not enough to swing open, just enough to make the metal knob quiver. I snatched up the phone, hit home first by reflex, then my neighbor Mrs. Delacroix. Nothing. No dial tone. Just a thick hiss, like someone breathing through their teeth. I hung up and pressed my ear to the receiver again. Same hiss. From behind me, through the wood of the closet door, I heard that whisper again. Not loud, almost fond. "Birdie, open it." My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the receiver. It hit the cabinet and swung on its cord. I knew I shouldn't go near the closet. I knew that, in the blunt, animal way kids know certain things before they have words for them. But there was this crack along the base where the trim had pulled away from the floorboard years before, and some horrible part of me needed to know if there was really somebody in there or if I was losing my mind in my own kitchen. I got down on my stomach on the old vinyl, cold against my chest, and put my face near that narrow crack. The television light from the living room reached just far enough across the floor that I could see the dust under the door, the little fur balls, the dark line of the space beyond. For 1 second I saw nothing. Then a face moved toward the gap from inside, slow and deliberate, until a pair of yellowed adult eyes were staring straight back at me from inches away. They caught the blue flicker from the television and shone wet. I remember the lashes. I remember the skin around them looked gray, squeezed tight somehow, like whatever belonged to those eyes was folded into a space it should not have fit inside. I don't remember standing up. I was just suddenly on my feet with my mouth open and no sound coming out. The closet door gave one hard thump from the inside. Then another. The frame rattled. The slide lock scraped metal on metal. I ran for the front door again first, stupidly, still hoping it had fixed itself, and when it didn't I went to the back. The sliding glass door was shut and pinned with the little security bar my dad used at night. My fingers wouldn't work right. I kept fumbling the bar, knocking it loose, dropping it, grabbing it again. Behind me I could hear the closet door opening in little jerks, wood groaning, something dragging over the floorboards. I grabbed one of the kitchen chairs, the heavy one with the split cane seat, and swung it into the glass as hard as I could. The first hit starred it. The second hit blew a hole through and sprayed wet air and tiny cubes of glass across the linoleum. I climbed through anyway. I felt one piece slice my calf, but I barely registered it. I ran across the soaked yard in my socks, through the grass that slapped cold against my ankles, and pounded on Mrs. Delacroix's back door so hard my knuckles bruised. She opened it in her pink robe, took one look at me, and hauled me inside before I could get words out. I did not look back. I remember standing in her little hallway with my chest jerking and my hands locked into claws while she slid her deadbolt shut. Only then did I start screaming. My parents and the police went back over there with flashlights. They found the broken glass, the phone off the hook, the front locks turned, and the closet under the stairs hanging open. Nothing else. No person, no broken panel, no tunnel, no way out. They kept saying maybe somebody had been hiding in the basement and slipped out while everyone was outside, maybe a prank. Maybe I got myself worked up and misread what I saw through the crack. I was 10, bleeding through one sock, and I still knew that was wrong. The closet was less than 3 feet deep. I know that because my dad measured it later while he was red-faced and trying not to look scared in front of me. There was nowhere for a full-grown adult body to go. After that night, they let me stay with my aunt for a week, and when I finally came home, every closet door in the house stood open because I couldn't bear not seeing inside them. I still live alone now, but every closet door in my apartment is taped shut with strips of heavy packing tape I replace every couple of months when the edges start to peel. What I can't get past isn't the whisper, or even the eyes. It's the part that doesn't finish. I still don't know how a grown person could have folded themselves into a space that shallow, behind a door I had opened 100 times before, without anyone noticing they were there. I don't know where they went in the minute between me smashing that glass and the police searching the house. And I still think about that little wet handprint on the outside of the door, because if someone was already inside the closet, then that print didn't come from something trying to get out. It came from something touching the place where my hand was about to be. I told myself for years that kids remember fear wrong, that the mind stretches things, that maybe I made a shape into a face because I needed one. But I still buy apartments based on how few doors they have. I still check every latch twice before bed. And if a closet in my place ever starts feeling colder than the room around it, I don't investigate. I just sit there with fresh tape in my hand, staring at the seam, waiting to see if something on the other side already knows my name. The next one happened to somebody who thought a window was safer, because at least you can see through glass. That's only true if whatever's outside wants to be seen. Story 2. The night window. The worst part wasn't the photo. People always think it was the photo. It wasn't. It was finding those old drawings under my childhood bed. Page after page of the same bedroom window with a face pressed to the glass while a lump under a blanket slept on the bed. I used to sleep with a heavy blanket over my head every night because I hated looking into dark rooms. For a long time I thought that was a weird kid habit. Then I found out what I might have been hiding from. My name's Owen Lark. I'm 22. And this happened the summer I came home from college to help my parents clear out our house on Alder Run before they downsized. It was a big Victorian at the edge of town with cedar trim, crooked gutters, and woods packed right up against the back of the property. The place always smelled like cedarwood, dust, and my mother's drying lavender bundles hanging in the pantry. Branches scraped the siding almost all day and all night. You got used to it if you grew up there, or at least I did. I was comfortable alone there in a way I wasn't anywhere else. My room was on the second floor at the back, overlooking the tree line, and even though the upstairs hall always felt too long compared to the downstairs one, with one extra narrow door near the end that never seemed to lead anywhere important, I never thought of the house as threatening. It was just old, drafty, and bigger than my parents really needed anymore. That first evening back, I was under the bed sorting boxes when I found a flat cardboard portfolio stuffed with childhood drawings. Most were what you'd expect: trees, the dog we had when I was 7, weird blocky houses. Then I got to a stack where every drawing was the same window. My window. Same slanted ceiling above it, same maple tree outside. In every picture there was a round pale face flattened against the glass, looking in at the bed. The bed always had a blanket-shaped mound under it. I stared at them for a while, then laughed a little because the alternative would have been sitting there on the floor admitting I was disturbed by crayon drawings I apparently made myself. I figured I'd had one repeating nightmare and drawn it out a dozen times because that's what kids do. My degree's in architecture. I spend half my life turning odd structures into practical explanations. That habit doesn't shut off just because you're back in your childhood room. The next morning I noticed the marks outside the window. Small circular indentations in the dirt directly below the sill, each one the same size, neat as if somebody had pressed the end of a broom handle into the wet ground over and over. I crouched there in my socks, coffee cooling in my hand, and looked at them through the screen. We got raccoons sometimes. Stray cats too. Something was probably coming up to the glass at night and messing around with its own reflection. That explanation was ordinary enough that I didn't think twice. I even said it to my mother later when she mentioned the garden soil looked disturbed. She nodded and asked if I'd take a load of old books to the donation center. Normal conversation. Normal day. I spent most of the afternoon sorting books in the upstairs hall, passing that extra door more times than I could count. Every time I did, I had the odd feeling the knob was on the wrong side, like I'd remembered the whole little door backward. That night I slept in my old room because there was no reason not to. I still had the habit of pulling a blanket partly over my head. Not because I was scared exactly, more because it made the room feel contained. I woke around dawn sweating under all that weight and saw the window lock sitting open. I remember thinking I must have bumped it while opening the window for air, except I hadn't opened the window at all. It was humid, the kind of early summer heat that made the sheets stick to your legs, and I knew I'd locked it because the old latch always took a firm push and made a dry metal click. I shut it again. Problem solved. Later that day I found 3 objects lined up on the inner sill. A smooth gray stone, a blue ribbon faded almost white at the crease, and a rusted key with no tag on it. I stood there for a full minute trying to place them because my first assumption was that I had put them there myself while unpacking. But I hadn't. They weren't mine. The ribbon was old enough to shed powder when I touched it. The stone was warm from the sun. The key left a reddish stain on my fingertip. I took them downstairs and asked my dad if they belonged to him. He barely looked up from the piano bench where he was sorting sheet music. "Probably attic junk," he said. "Set it by the donation pile." Practical. Dismissive. Good. I preferred it that way. It meant I didn't have to be the one making a thing out of objects appearing inside a locked room. By the third morning, when the window latch was open again, I stopped treating it like bad memory and started checking the hardware. The frame was old, sure, but not broken. I pressed the latch, tugged the sash, checked the alignment. Solid. I even wedged a folded receipt in the track so I'd know if the window had been lifted. That felt sensible. Measured. I was not panicking. I was diagnosing. The woods outside were quiet except for insects and the branches scraping over the siding in slow, fingernail-like strokes. Every now and then I'd catch that smell of dust and lavender, then something greener under it, the wet smell of bark after sundown. It wasn't threatening, exactly. Just off. Like when you hear somebody play a familiar song in the wrong key and it takes your brain a second to understand why your shoulders are tense. That afternoon I asked my mother if she remembered me drawing the window over and over as a kid. She looked distracted, arms full of folded table linens, and said, "You used to draw all kinds of strange things. You were always covering your head at night too. We thought you just liked being cocooned." She laughed a little at that word. Cocooned. I almost mentioned the latch and the objects on the sill, then didn't. Saying it out loud would have made me sound ridiculous, and I had no evidence except a handful of trinkets and my own certainty. So instead I took the box of drawings back upstairs and looked through them more carefully. In some, the face at the glass was just a circle with dark eyes. In others, it had a long, narrow jaw and something like hair hanging straight down. The weirdest part was that the blanket on the bed was always drawn over the sleeper's head. Every picture understood that detail. That night, the whistling started. Very faint. Not close to the house, more from the woods beyond the yard, where the undergrowth got thick and the trees stood so tight together the moonlight never seemed to reach the ground. It was a melody I recognized right away because my father used to play it on the piano on Sunday mornings. A simple little tune from an old movie he liked. I could hear the real piano downstairs at the same time, him stumbling through scales while he packed music books. The whistling kept pace with it in the distance. Not perfectly, but enough that once I noticed the overlap I couldn't ignore it. I went to the hall window and listened with my hand on the trim. The wood was cool and slightly greasy from old varnish. The hall stretched longer than it should have in the dim light, and for a second I had the disorienting thought that if I looked toward that extra door I might see it standing open. I didn't look. I went back into my room and locked the window again. The next morning the receipt wedge was still in the track, untouched, and the latch was unfastened. That's the kind of detail that strips away the comforting options one at a time. If the window hadn't been lifted, then somebody hadn't climbed in through it. If the latch still opened, then either the mechanism was doing something I didn't understand, or someone had access from inside the room while I slept. I stood there with my pulse knocking in my throat and my feet cold on the floorboards, and still I didn't wake my parents. That's the part people judge. But I genuinely thought there was a fixable explanation just out of reach. Houses shift. Old hardware fails. Memory fills in gaps with drama. Those are all true statements. They just weren't enough anymore. I spent that day carrying boxes to the car and feeling watched without ever catching movement. It wasn't fear in the obvious sense. It was wrongness. The kind that makes you keep checking whether a frame on the wall is level or whether somebody moved the silverware drawer half an inch. I noticed the upstairs hallway again when I brought down winter coats. Longer than downstairs by several steps, impossible given the footprint of the house. I noticed the extra door standing a little more ajar than before, showing only darkness inside, though I could have sworn it had been shut that morning. I noticed the dirt under my window had fresh circles in it, exact same diameter, exact same spacing. And at dusk, when the trees beyond the yard turned into one continuous black wall, I saw something pale between them that vanished when I tried to focus on it. Maybe a birch trunk, maybe somebody's shirt, maybe nothing. I didn't tell my parents because I didn't want to infect the whole move with one of those family panics that turns into a story everybody laughs about later while the person who started it looks unstable. So instead I tested the thing I could test. I waited until just after midnight, turned off the room light, and used the high-definition camera on my phone. I propped my elbows on the desk, steadied my breathing, and aimed through the glass toward the woods. On the screen it looked flatter than real life, just tree trunks and darkness and the faint silver edge of the yard. I took one long exposure shot, then another. Nothing obvious. On the third, while the image processed, the room behind me reflected in the window. My own bed, the desk, my shoulders. Then the screen sharpened what my eyes couldn't. About 30 feet into the trees, perfectly still between two trunks, was a tall, gaunt figure holding a ladder upright. Not climbing, not moving, just holding it so the top reached exactly to the height of my bedroom window. I don't know how long I stared before my body reacted. My hands had gone numb around the phone. I could feel my pulse in my gums, weirdly, and the back of my shirt was wet. I shut the curtains first, then immediately hated that because now I couldn't see outside at all. I opened them a sliver and there was nothing there. No figure, no ladder, just the dark tree line and the branch tips moving against each other. I checked the photo again. Still there. Long limbs, head slightly tilted, ladder in both hands like a measurement. That's what got me. It didn't look like somebody about to enter. It looked like somebody who had already learned exactly how far they needed to reach and had chosen not to. I packed one bag before sunrise. Jeans, chargers, laptop, the folder of drawings, nothing else. When my mother asked why I was dressed to leave that early, I told her I felt sick and didn't want to risk giving them whatever I had. She touched my forehead, said I felt clammy, and accepted it because people accept illness faster than fear. I drove back to my dorm on 4 hours of broken breathing and kept checking the rearview mirror even though there was nobody behind me on the county road. I never went back to that house. My parents finished clearing it out themselves and moved by the end of the month. I asked later if anything else strange happened near my old room. My father just said, "Those woods always had somebody in them." Like that answered anything. Maybe to him it did. I still don't sleep in rooms with windows if I can avoid it. In my last apartment, I rented the interior bedroom and used the one with the view for storage. In my dorm after that, I pinned blankets over the blinds so tightly the resident advisor joked I'd welded them shut. I know how irrational that sounds. The thing I can't answer is simple, and it's the reason none of my explanations ever settled right. Who was the figure in the woods, and why did they never come in while I was sleeping, not once, not when they apparently could have reached the glass whenever they wanted? Sometimes I think that's worse than an attack would have been. Entering would have made them a burglar, a prowler, a person with a category. Standing there night after night, opening nothing, taking nothing, leaving little objects where I'd find them in the morning. That leaves me with someone I still can't name. And if I can't name them, I can't tell myself they've stopped. When people ask why I never visit my parents' new place for long, I make a joke about small-town nostalgia giving me hives. It's easier than explaining how a room can stay wrong in your body after you've left it. I still have the photo on an old hard drive I never open. I still have the childhood drawings in a folder I keep meaning to throw away and never do. What bothers me now is the possibility that the face in those drawings wasn't the figure I photographed years later. Not exactly. The jawline changes. The eyes sit wrong. Like I spent childhood recording a watcher I couldn't understand, and college was just the first time it let me photograph the shape it had chosen that night. The next story starts with handwriting, which sounds harmless until it looks enough like your own that you stop trusting what you've remembered all your life. Story 3. The Diary Entry. I thought I was opening a record of my childhood. What I actually opened was something that had been keeping a record of me. The page was dated from when I was 12, and in my cramped old handwriting it described a new friend in the backyard who knew my games, my hiding places, the nickname I used for my left-handed softball glove. Then I turned the page and the writing shifted. Same letters, same slant, same little loop on the Y, but wrong in the way a forged signature is wrong when someone has practiced it too much. My name is Lenora Sayer. I'm 42, and I work alone most days in the county records basement indexing deeds and probate files. My whole adult life is paper, handwriting, dates, discrepancies. I say that because I want you to understand I am not careless with documents. A few months ago, I was at my parents' old ranch house on Westcott Avenue, helping clear the attic because they'd finally decided to sell. The place backed up to a huge municipal park, mostly dark trees and cracked walking paths, and even in daylight the yard felt isolated in a way the front of the house never did. Out front you had the hum of traffic, lawn mowers, the smell of cut grass and gasoline. Out back it was quieter than it should have been. Just ozone in the air from an incoming storm and the faint wash of cars from far away. The house had always felt a little unstable to me, not physically, just spatially. Rooms seemed smaller in late afternoon than they did in the morning. The hallway to the bedrooms sometimes felt too short. I grew up there, so I stopped noticing it. The attic trunk was mine. Cheap cedar veneer, brass corners, a sticker of a yellow horse on the lid. I brought it down to the guest room and sat cross-legged on the carpet going through yearbooks, bead bracelets, school papers. Finding the diary actually felt good at first. I kept a detailed journal from about age 10 to 14, then stopped all at once when I discovered the special humiliation of rereading yourself. I hadn't opened it in 20 years. The first strange thing was a page describing dreams from 1 week in exact detail. The green hall with wet walls, the man outside the fence, the feeling that someone was breathing from under my bed. I had no memory of writing any of it. Still, that's not impossible. Kids write things and forget. I work around records all day that mean everything to one version of a person and nothing to the older one. So I told myself my younger self had just been more observant, or more dramatic, than I remembered. I almost took a photo and sent it to my mother with some joke about being an eerie child. I didn't, because even then there was a part of me that didn't want to invite commentary. That's a flaw in me, probably. If something seems off, my first instinct is not to make a scene. It's to gather myself, make sure I'm not overreacting, avoid looking foolish. So I kept reading alone in the guest room while the storm built outside. The windows rattled softly. The whole house smelled like old fabric and hot dust from the attic. The entries moved through ordinary kid things, fights with classmates, TV shows, boredom, then came back again and again to the new friend in the backyard. Same phrasing each time. Not a name, just new friend. They liked the same games as me. They knew where I hid things. They were me, sort of, except meaner. I remember pausing there and thinking my younger self had invented a double, the way lonely kids do. Then the dates kept going after the point where I know I stopped journaling. I stopped at 14 because my cousin read an entry and teased me until I cried. I remember shoving the diary into that trunk and refusing to write another line. But there were pages dated months later. Then years. Little entries wedged between blank sheets, written in the same child hand about my braces coming off, my first car, a college acceptance. Details that happened after I had abandoned the diary for good. I sat there hearing rain tick harder against the house and tried to build a normal answer. Maybe I'd come back to it briefly and forgotten. Maybe my mother had written notes in it for some reason, though that made no sense. Maybe I was conflating a second notebook with this one. Every explanation sounded thin as soon as I heard it in my own head. What kept me seated instead of marching downstairs to show somebody was embarrassment. I know how weak that sounds, but it matters. My parents already think I turn old family objects into mysteries because of my job. I could hear my father's voice before he even said it. Len, it's a notebook, not the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I kept reading, hoping the weirdness would flatten out under scrutiny. Didn't. The new friend entries got more specific. It wasn't described as an imaginary friend. It was described as me if I stopped pretending to be nice. It knew which teachers I hated. It knew where I buried the bracelet I'd stolen from a cousin and felt sick about for weeks. It knew I sometimes stood at the back window and imagined walking straight into the park and never coming home. The tone wasn't confessional. It was observational, amused, like whoever wrote it wasn't me remembering feelings. It was somebody beside me, listing them. At the back of the diary, tucked into the pocket where I used to keep stickers, there was a Polaroid. Recent. Bright enough to be recent. It showed my apartment desk, the chipped blue mug I use for pens, the lamp with the bent neck, and me sitting in profile in the glow of my monitor. It had been taken through my own living room window. I know that because the angle was from the fire escape landing outside, and there are raindrops on the glass from the storm we had in the city the week before. My stomach went so tight I had to put the diary down on the bedspread. Up until then I thought I was dealing with a document problem, some unnerving family prank, maybe a stalker if I forced the thought all the way into the open. But that photo reached across time and grabbed the back of my neck. It made every backyard entry retroactively toxic. It made the new friend less like an invention and more like a witness that had never left. I finally took the book downstairs and almost showed my mother. She was in the kitchen wrapping plates and newspaper, humming to herself, and I stood there with the diary in my hand while the refrigerator clicked on and the storm gutter outside spilled water in uneven bursts. All I had to do was say, "Look at this." Instead, I asked whether she remembered me talking about a friend in the yard when I was little. She frowned and said, "You used to talk to yourself back there all the time." That was it. Not concern. Not curiosity. Just the kind of answer that closes a subject because adults don't realize which childhood details children remember as warnings. I nodded like that helped and went back upstairs feeling stupid for not forcing the issue. That was the last point where I still believed I understood the shape of the situation. I thought I was verifying whether I'd had an imaginary friend. I thought there was a category waiting if I was brave enough to use the right word. Instead, the categories fell apart one by one. I reread the earliest entries and noticed things that hadn't landed before. Places where the new friend used a phrase I didn't start saying until my 20s. A joke about a supervisor I have now, hidden in a childish sentence by changing one word. References to future apartments, future jobs, breakups I had not yet had when the ink first went down. The mimicry wasn't perfect. That was the worst part. It was close enough to pass until you knew what your own life actually looked like. Then the errors stood up like bent nails. Whoever, whatever, had been writing me since childhood didn't become me. Studied me. It rehearsed. It made versions. And if the Polaroid was real, which it was because I could feel the gloss and smell the chemical tang of it, then the rehearsal had moved from the page into the room where I live. I drove back to my apartment that night, and the whole way there I kept thinking of small moments from childhood that had never scared me at the time. Hearing my own laugh from the yard when I was inside. Finding toys set up exactly the way I liked them after I hadn't touched them for days. Waking with the blanket pulled over my feet in July when I always kicked it off. Harmless. Forgettable. Until you place them next to a book full of future tense written in your childhood hand. By the time I got home, I couldn't sit in my living room without imagining that photo being taken. Somebody on the landing, quiet enough not to shift the metal grate. Somebody looking in while I answered email and reheated leftovers and assumed privacy was still a real thing. I slept with the kitchen lights on and the diary in a grocery bag tied shut, as if thin plastic could contain it. The next morning I stopped trying to preserve dignity and went back to my parents' house determined to end it in a way that would at least feel final. The storm had passed. The backyard grass was wet and flattened in strips, like something had lain in it overnight. I took the trunk, the diary, every loose paper from that attic corner, and dragged them to the back of the yard near the old concrete birdbath. My parents were out meeting a realtor. I wanted them gone. The park beyond the fence was dark even at noon under the trees. I poured lighter fluid over the whole pile with my hands shaking so badly it splashed on my shoes. Before I lit it, I looked once toward the attic vent over the garage because I had this crawling certainty I was being watched from the house I grew up in. And I saw movement there, not much, just a pale shape withdrawing from the shadow, quick and familiar in posture, like someone stepping back because I'd caught them copying me. When the fire took, it went fast. Dry paper gives off a bright, greedy sound, almost cheerful, and the diary curled inward on itself as the pages blackened from the edges. Then something screamed from the crawlspace access at the side of the house. I need to be careful here because I don't want to sound theatrical. Could have been an animal. It could have been a fox, a raccoon, any number of things forced from hiding by heat and noise. But it sounded wrong in a personal way. Same pitch as a human voice trying not to be one. I turned toward the dark opening under the eaves and for a second I saw a face down there with my own outline. Not features exactly, more the arrangement of them. Eyes where mine should be, mouth working around a sound it hadn't practiced enough. I didn't run. That's the only brave thing I did. I stood there until the screaming stopped and the last pages collapsed into wet black strips. The diary is gone. The trunk is gone. My parents think I had some practical reason for destroying old papers damaged by mildew, and I let them think that because I am still, apparently, the kind of person who would rather be misunderstood than look unstable. But ever since then I've had the suspicion that a lot of what I call my personality may actually be adaptation. Preferences learned in response to being mirrored for too long. Certain jobs chosen because they kept me in basements with files. Certain apartments chosen because the windows faced brick. Certain relationships ended because the thought of being fully known made my skin crawl, and I couldn't tell whether that instinct was mine or something I was taught by being watched. What I don't know is whether burning those pages ended anything or just closed one format. If the mimic had been writing me from childhood onward, if it had already reached my adult apartment and my adult routines, then maybe the diary was only where it practiced first. Maybe fire just took away the draft. I still catch myself hearing one of my own phrases come out of my mouth and wondering if I chose it, or if I read it somewhere years ago in a line I thought I wrote. And every now and then, when I open a fresh notebook for work, I check the last page before I use the first, because I am terrified of finding tomorrow in my old handwriting, waiting for me to make it true. The last story is about a house that never really let its residents leave, which sounds metaphorical until the front windows start looking back. Story 4. The House Next Door. I was on my way home with groceries when I saw the new owners of my childhood house putting up a for sale sign after living there for 1 week. I pulled over because in a town like ours, people don't move that fast unless somebody dies or somebody lies. The woman hammering the post had both hands shaking. When I asked if everything was all right, she looked at me like she had been waiting for exactly my face and whispered that they kept finding little notes in the cupboards, all addressed to the nickname only my family used for me when I was a boy. My name is Graham Pell, I'm 58, and I still live in Calder because leaving turned out to be more expensive than staying. My mother needed help until she passed. My work was here. My life settled into these same streets whether I wanted that or not. I was a paramedic for 30 years. I've been in wrecked cars, bad apartments, houses full of smoke, all the places where panic makes people useless. I say that because I am not somebody who startles easy. I know what stress does to memory and how neighborhoods build legends to explain ordinary rot. Calder is the kind of old-town tourists call charming. Tree-lined streets, brick storefronts, wet asphalt after rain, pine needles in every gutter, wood smoke in winter. Every hour the bells from the hill carry over the roofs and make the whole place feel older than it is. The odd thing, the thing I stopped noticing until recently, is that every house in my childhood neighborhood has the same hand-painted wooden sign on the front door. White letters on dark green. Occupied. That evening I had taken the long way home past my old street mostly out of habit. The house next door to my childhood home had been empty for years, curtains gone yellow, porch sinking. Now it was brightly lit. Through the front window I saw figures moving inside and had the brief, stupid sensation of seeing my own family as they were in the late 1970s. My father's narrow shoulders. My mother's hair rolled under at the ends. A child at the table with my same bowl haircut. I actually laughed under my breath and thought some local theater group must have rented the place to rehearse a period piece. We get that in Calder Historical Society nonsense, porch photos, tours. That explanation fit neatly enough that I let it hold for the rest of my grocery run. But once the new owner of my old house showed me one of the notes, that explanation started to split. The paper was folded into a square the way my mother used to pack lunch notes. Inside, in crooked pencil, it said, "Come home, Gracie. Supper's almost ready." Nobody has called me Gracie since I was about 8. Seeing it in my own childhood style, those fat, uneven letters, made something small and hard settle under my ribs. I asked where she'd found it. She said in the flour tin, though they don't keep flour in tins, not anymore. Her husband was in the doorway behind her holding the dark green occupied sign they'd already taken off the front door. He looked like he'd rather touch a live wire than put it in the moving truck. I told them kids might be messing around, old neighborhood prank. That was what my experience gave me. Find the human reason. Reduce the field. Deal with the thing in front of you. For 2 days nothing happened except that every time I drove past after work, the lights in my old house were wrong in a familiar way. Front room lamp on, kitchen dark, hall light flicking once, then the upstairs back room glowing for a minute. The exact sequence my family used 30 years ago when my father got home first, checked the thermostat, then called up the stairs. It wasn't approximate. It was exact. That needled me more than the note did, because exact patterns mean rehearsal. They mean somebody studied. I told myself maybe the new owners were just settling in and happened to use the same lamps at the same times. Houses train behavior. You enter a room, a switch is where the switch is, and before long you're moving like everybody else who lived there. I believed that for almost a full evening. Then I found the first note in my own mailbox. Same pencil. Same paper. Graham, don't make us wait. I hadn't opened a mailbox note like that since I was a paperboy. My chest tightened in a way I didn't like. Not fear yet. More annoyance turning physical. I checked the box for signs of tampering, looked up and down the street, even knocked on my neighbor June's door and asked if she'd seen kids running through yards. She hadn't. She also told me, unprompted, that somebody had rehung her occupied sign after she'd taken it down to repaint the door. She laughed when she said it. I didn't. That was the first little release, the first moment I thought maybe this was a local nuisance broad enough to be boring. Not about me. Not personal. That lasted until the next morning, when there were 3 more notes in my box, all in my childhood hand, all using details no neighborhood prankster should know. One mentioned the marbles I buried under the lilac bush when I was 9 because I was sure my cousin would steal them. I took those notes inside, spread them on the kitchen table, and tried to approach it the way I'd approach a bad scene call. Slow breathing. Inventory. Paper stock. Cheap and modern. Pencil, soft lead. No fingerprints I could see, which wasn't saying much. Outside, the bells marked the hour. Somewhere down the block a dog barked twice and stopped. I was halfway through convincing myself somebody had gotten into old family boxes at a yard sale when I saw 3 people in the park across from my street. Childhood friends of mine, or good enough copies that my breath snagged. One in a red windbreaker like Toby Rinn used to wear. One taller girl with a braid down her back like Della Kerr. They were walking the paved loop in perfect rhythm, same pace, same spacing, heads turned not toward the path ahead but toward my old house. They didn't speak. They just circled. I went out onto my porch, expecting the scene to break under direct attention. Didn't. They rounded the far side of the park and came back again in the same order, same silence, same fixed look toward those windows. That should have been enough to send me elsewhere for the night. Any sane person would say that. The problem is, I have real experience with bad nights and real emergencies, and that experience had trained me into a mistake. I kept trying to file this under something I'd already survived. Harassment. Delusion by proxy. Small-town cruelty. Maybe even the early stages of my own stress finally cashing a bill. I told myself that if I kept observing, a pattern would become a cause. Instead, the pattern only got cleaner. Every evening the lights in my old house repeated old sequences. Every morning a new note appeared in my box. Every afternoon somebody from my childhood looped the park once or twice more than the day before. It was escalation so measured it felt instructional, like whatever was doing it wanted to teach me what it could reach before it asked for more. On the 4th evening I walked to the edge of my old property and looked through the front window. I didn't mean to get that close. I just wanted proof of a setup, some projector, some people in costume, some stupid, solvable mechanism. The glass reflected the street at first. My own shoulders ghosted over the room. Then the interior came into view. Same living room layout my parents had. Same lamp in the corner. Same crocheted throw folded over the armchair, though none of those things belonged to the current owners. And standing in the center of the room was me. Not a younger me. Not a version from some family photo. An adult man my exact age and build. Same receding hairline. Same left shoulder hitch I got after a lifting injury years back. He was holding one of the green wooden signs against his chest. Occupied. He looked at me with the flat patience of somebody waiting for a delayed train. I stumbled back hard enough to hit the porch rail. My pulse went ragged. I could feel it in the hollow under my tongue. The copy in the window lifted one hand and tapped the sign twice with one finger, almost conversational. Then the hall light behind him switched on, then off. Then the upstairs back room lit the way it had every night that week. Pattern, release, pattern again, tighter each time. I went home without remembering the walk. Twice I thought I heard footsteps matching mine half a beat late. By the time I got to my own front door, my hands were slick and weak. I locked everything, dragged the old plywood sheets from the garage, and started boarding windows while daylight was still bleeding out of the sky. Hammer, nail, breath. Hammer, nail, breath. My chest hurt. My throat kept closing on dry air. I called June once, then hung up before it rang because what was I going to say? Don't look outside. My neighborhood has started repeating me. Night came down in layers. First the bells, then the street lamps, then the blue televisions in nearby homes winking out one by one. I sat on my living room floor in the dark with the last unboarded slit of front window open just enough to watch the street. They were there before full dark. Copies. Not exact and not all of people I knew well, but close enough that memory filled in the missing parts. Childhood friends. A teacher. My father at about 40. A girl I kissed once behind the baseball field. They moved in perfect circles around my house. Not fast, not slow. Shoes whispering over the sidewalk in the same rhythm until it stopped sounding like footsteps and started sounding like a clock. Every few loops one of them would pause and turn its head toward my front door, as if checking whether I'd come out yet. None approached. None knocked. Around midnight I saw, at the far end of the street, the adult version of me carrying the occupied sign from my old house toward mine, disappearing and reappearing between trunks as the walkers passed. I stayed where I was until dawn with a flashlight in one hand and the hammer in the other, too afraid to blink for long. By morning the street was empty. No footprints I could trust, because it had rained lightly before dawn and the pavement was smeared with pine needles and runoff. The notes kept coming after that, though less often, as if whoever had set the pace knew exactly how much pressure to apply. I stopped leaving except for absolute necessity, then eventually stopped even that. Groceries get delivered to the back porch. The plywood stays up. People in town think I've turned into a hermit because retirement didn't suit me. Let them think it. It beats explaining that I am no longer sure solitude is empty. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, I hear the hourly bells and then a second rhythm beneath them, shoes on sidewalk, a loop starting somewhere just outside view. What I can't answer is how many houses in Calder are occupied in the same way. Not lived in, occupied. There is a difference. I notice the green signs now everywhere. I notice how often a porch light in one place matches a memory from another. I notice families who move in fast and move out faster, and older residents who never seem to open their curtains after dark. Maybe this is only my street. Maybe it's every old house in town replaying its residents until the copies learn enough to keep the place running without them. I don't know the goal of the loop, only that it keeps widening. Last week, just before dusk, I found a fresh green sign leaning against the inside of my own front door, even though I haven't opened that door in 3 months, and the paint was still tacky enough to cling to my fingertips.